Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm Carolyn Wong. I'm your State Grazing Land Management Specialist. I was given this hat a little earlier this year in February. Prior to that, I had the awesome privilege of being a planner on the Big Island for about 13 years with a few details to other offices in there. Given that, I've worked or trained with most of you that are on the line at some point, and I'm really glad to already have some of those relationships started. And for any of you that I haven't met yet, I really look forward to getting to know you and work with you. This past summer, the PIA technology team came together to discuss training and the results of some of the recent training needs surveys. Both surveys identified a major need and desire from the offices for training on grazing land issues. Wally was commenting earlier that he's been waiting 8 years for this. From the experience I've had so far in assisting other offices, either in person or over the phone, it became pretty evident that we really have folks from all different levels of understanding when it comes to grazing. Some of you are very knowledgeable. You're, in fact, producers yourself, and for some of you, some of this might be a refresher. Some of you, though, have little to no background on grazing, either from your education or through practical experience. And all of you have surely been really trying your hardest to do your best to really provide good service to our client grazers, and have definitely expressed that you would like to know more. And so I'm really pleased, because I can talk about grass for days. When I stepped back and tried to figure out how to start addressing this training need, or this need for technical ability, I kind of figured that the best thing would be to start with some basics, lay a foundation, and then build from there. So that's what we're going to start doing today. This is the first time I'm conducting a webinar, so please bear with me, and let's get to it. Today we're going to be talking about forages. All right, so some of the overall objectives of this training are to build an awareness of forage plant anatomy. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. That pole is still blocking the view.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Cool, thanks.
Yep. Oh, Hilo joined us. Thank you. Waimea. Kaului, great. Just about everybody was able to jump on. Awesome. Okay, there we go. Is that better?
Yep, that's it.
All right, fantastic. So again, the objectives, just to start building an awareness of plant anatomy, shore up an understanding of how forage plants function and grow, building an awareness of forage quality factors, and then really talking about what different factors affect plant vigor. So to start with the grasses, we basically classify our grasses loosely as bunch grass or sod-forming grasses. Grasses can start from seeds or sprigs, which are vegetative, where they root at the nodes. We also classify grasses as cool season or warm season, also known as temperate or tropical. This mostly refers to the climates that these grasses are mostly adapted to and their photosynthetic pathway, whether they're C3 or C4 grasses. And then all grasses go through these phases of growth. They start out as seedlings, they go through a vegetative stage, then they go into the elongation and transition phase, and then they get into the reproductive phase. A grass plant is basically, it's a collection of plant parts, like a tree or shrub, made up of growth units that we call tillers. Each tiller comes from roots and produces leaves. Vegetative tillers consist primarily of leaves, whereas a reproductive tiller produces a stem and a seed head in addition to leaves. The basal area of a stem, where the roots are, is called the crown. The crown usually has a number of buds or growing points or tillers that emerge from it. The crown also connects and supports all of the tillers that are attached to it, and they share water, carbohydrates, nutrients. Some tillers stay vegetative, while others become reproductive and produce seed heads. Whether a tiller becomes reproductive or not usually depends on the environment and the hormones produced in the plant. And for example, a reproductive tiller can remain vegetative if that growing point is removed by grazing. It'll stay in that vegetative state, which reduces the number of seed heads produced on a land unit, but it also can stimulate the formation of new tillers, which means more leaves. Vegetative tillers are usually less stemmy, and they're more nutritious than reproductive tillers. Seed production, on the other hand, can sometimes be valuable. Sometimes a producer has a need for seed to be produced in order to produce new seedlings in the stand and increase plant density. But seed production isn't always essential for stand maintenance. Yeah, a lot of our grasses reproduce vegetatively by tillering and creating roots from the nodes from stolons or rhizomes. All right, so a refresher on grass anatomy. There's some of the basic plant parts good to be aware of so that you know what they're talking about when you're trying to ID a grass and they're describing these different plant parts. Can you see my cursor on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the first part that we're going to talk about here is the awn. It's a bristle characteristic in the spikelet of some grasses. That's what it looks like or can look like. That's what we're talking about. Then we have nodes. Nodes are points on the stem where the leaf attaches. The internode is the area in between nodes. Okay, a lot of times grass ID plants will talk about these areas and their characteristics. We have rhizomes, which are basically a horizontal stem that grows underground, and they most times will root at the nodes. And stolons, which are just like rhizomes, but they're above ground. A lot of our grasses are stoloniferous. We have a sheath, which is the part of the leaf that goes around the stem. We have the collar, which is the part of the leaf that's right between the blade and the sheath. The ligule generally occurs at the collar, and it can either be a thin membrane or a fringe of hairs. And an auricle is this ear-like lobe at the base of the leaf adjacent to the collar. A lot of times the nuances, the details in these little, distinct plant parts can be some of the clues that we can use to identify a grass, especially when all we have is vegetative material and we don't have a seed head. I put this slide in here because it contains more details of ligules and auricles and collars that I find really healthy in doing grass ID, or I certainly did when I first started trying to learn this language. And so it brings us to our first quiz. Sorry, am I going too fast? That's okay? All right,
okay.
Then. Okay, great. We're just going to keep plugging away. Okay, I tried to incorporate some questions in order to keep things interesting and keep people awake because it is after lunch. But this is our first question. What are the two forms of grass? And if we could try to get everybody to respond, that would be awesome. All right. I got 11 responses. I think that's about how many, 12 are logged in, 13, great. And everybody's getting it right. We have bunch grasses and sod-forming grasses. Fantastic. 14, okay. All right, going on to our next question. What are the different ways that grasses are planted? Two answers here. Yay, everybody's engaging. Thank you. Okay, two ways grasses are planted. I wish it was by wishful thinking, but it does take setting out some seed or sprigs or vegetative material. Those are the two correct answers. All right, next question. Does temperature and climate matter to grass? Sure does. Whether we really want to try to make sure we got grasses that are adapted to the right, to the conditions that they're being planted in. Everybody got that one? Awesome. Next question. What are the phases of grass growth? There should be 4. Okay. Any more? This is good for me because it tells me maybe I went a little too fast over this. Not super critical, but we will come back to the part that is the most important. But there's 4 phases. We have the seedling phase, followed by the vegetative phase, followed by the elongation phase, and finally the reproductive phase. Those are the correct answers. Good job. Most of you got that. Most of you got that. Very good. Okay. Next question. What are the branches of a grass plant called? There's a specific term that we talked about that grass plants have that produces their leaves. Okay. The correct term for the branches of a grass plant are the tillers. Tillers can have stems and leaves for sure, but the tillers is the term that are used to describe grass plant, quote-unquote, branches, the parts of a grass plant. All right, next question. Where do tillers grow from? Got some comedians in the group. Awesome. Yep. Tillers come from the basal buds in the crown, the rhizome, or stolon. Awesome. And last question. When are tillers the tastiest? There was a time when they said that it's the most nutritious, plants are most nutritious at a certain stage, grass plants are. What was that? Awesome. Yep. When they're vegetative. Everybody got that one, slam dunk. Okay, very good. All right, that's the first quiz down. Let's go back to our slides. Okay, so plant physiology, deals right with the inner workings of the plant, the basic botany. Remember that growth as well as regrowth, it's coming from cell division and cell expansion inside the plant at the molecular level. These areas where cell division and expansion are happening are called, this fancy word, meristems. The successful grazer should have a basic understanding of grass physiology because one of the keys of good grazing management is maintaining these apical meristems in an active growth phase. The 3 types of meristems we have are these apical meristems, or oftentimes we call them leaf buds, where those leaves are forming, intercalary meristems, and the reproductive meristems, or floral buds. The key concept here is understanding that plants have these active areas called meristems. It's where cell division and cell expansion are happening and taking place. Keeping these areas healthy and capable of active growth is what helps support a healthy pasture and good pasture production. It's kind of like the factories. If you want to have a lot of output, you got to keep those factories open and keep them healthy and functioning. All right, apical meristem. The apical meristem is responsible for leaf formation. Each leaf is usually rolled in a tube-like form in the lower portion, and it unfurls as the blade extends. Subsequent leaves follow the same pattern. New leaves push up from the center of the rolled portion of the first leaf. The growth is similar to like the extension of a telescope. So in this figure, leaf 1 there is the oldest, and leaf 8, which is just emerging, is the newest. The growing point for this plant, this grass plant, the apical meristem, is way down here at or near the plant base or the soil surface. And generally when it's way down here, it tends to be protected from grazing. When an animal comes through and grazes its grass off, it'll remove most of the leaf tissue, but in most cases that won't harm this grass leaf factory, this area of growth where the cells are dividing and expanding and doing their thing to build new leaves. If this stays intact, this grass plant can regrow more quickly.
What? Don't touch it.
Okay?
Oh, because it was in our recycle.
Somebody needs to mute their line. Thank you. Okay, the intercalary meristem. This is just another term and function to be aware of as it supports leaf production. It's at the base. It's what supports the leaf to expand and grow. And, you know, as conservationists working with grazers, leaves are forage, and so just be aware of these terms and kind of understand their function because it's kind of important to growing grass. Okay, getting into these growth phases. So grasses and other plants progress through vegetative phase, transition phase, and a reproductive phase. In the vegetative phase, does someone need help muting their line? Sorry. In the vegetative phase, the grass shoots are mostly leaf. The leaf blade collars are nested in the base of the shoot, and there's no evidence of sheath elongation or culm development. In the vegetative stage, some of the things to kind of be aware of is this apical meristem is close to the ground. It's safe for grazing. It's going to stay intact and be available for regrowth of new leaves after a grazing event would occur. And just a reminder that this is when the grass is most digestible and most nutritious at this stage. Okay? All right. Moving on, in response to day length or temperature and a variety of other environmental variables, the apical meristem is gradually converted from a vegetative bud producing leaves to a floral bud preparing to produce a seed head. This process is called floral induction. This conversion phase is termed the transition phase. During the transition or elongation phase, the leaf sheets begin to elongate, and the culm internodes will also elongate the area between the two nodes, raising that floral bud and the leaf bases to a grazable height. The floral buds are preparing the plant for the reproductive phase.
There's 10.
Hey, can you mute your line? Thank you. So the main thing to understand about this phase and what about it is this is when the grass is a little more vulnerable. The growing point has now risen. It's no longer down at the bottom. It's coming up, and it becomes vulnerable to grazing. The animal can come through and take that off, and now that growing point is no longer there to produce leaves. Okay? We're going to keep going. And now we're talking about the reproductive phase. The reproductive phase is when the conversion from vegetative to floral bud is all done, and the unseen inflorescence is starting to come out and get ready to emerge from the leaf sheath. Just before it emerges, this phase is commonly known as the boot stage of development. After that, the inflorescence will come out fully from the sheath. The seeds will mature, they'll dry and drop, and at this point, the grass's life cycle is complete, and that grass plant generally would begin to senesce. Successful regrowth following a defoliation really depends on productive plant meristems or buds. plant species with growing points that get elevated during that elongation phase become more vulnerable to grazing than plants that keep them low to the ground. And plants that make it all the way, tillers, I should say, that make it all the way to this reproductive phase, that apical meristem now has produced that seed head, and it's pretty much done. It's going to sit there, and the other tillers, if they haven't also gone into reproductive phase, will have to take over producing leaves for photosynthesis and whatnot. Okay, that's the end of that section. When I get to these quizzes, I'm going to bring up the questions, and this is a good time to stop and ask any questions for the stuff I've already covered. I am going to try to keep going pretty efficiently, but if you're totally lost on something, speak up. All right, first question. What areas in the grass plant produce growth? Yeah, I didn't want to make these questions too hard. Hopefully it's just to keep you guys engaged. Awesome. Everybody got it. The meristem, great. Okay, next question. Sorry, there really isn't a faster way for me to go between questions. Okay, which type of meristem produces leaves? Right, the primary meristem that is responsible for producing leaves is the apical meristem. Good job. Okay, next question. Which type supports leaf expansion? Don't worry, nobody's getting graded. But yeah, good. Intercalary meristems are the is the meristematic area that supports the leaf opening up after it emerges from the boot. Good job. Or I'm sorry, after it emerges from the leaf. All right. Okay. During the elongation phase, what happens to the apical meristem? Okay, good. It does not get hairy and moody or move out with his friends, but it does move up and transform into a floral bud. Very good. That is the correct answer. Okay. What are the flowers of the grass plant called? Yeah, we commonly refer to them as seed heads, but the correct answer is inflorescence. That's the technically correct answer. And it is how you will see them described in plant ID books. Okay. Couple more. What's the stage called just before the inflorescence emerges? Right, the stage just before the inflorescence emerges is called the boot stage. It is a pre-emergent stage, but the actual term is the boot stage. Okay. And do we have any more? One more. Is the grass still good to graze after it seeds? I only mentioned this very briefly, but all right, you guys pretty much know the answer. Yeah, it's still good. The quality's gone down some, but it's decent. You can certainly eat it. All right, fantastic. Close these. And does anyone have any questions?
Carolyn, Tony here. It's just maybe you're going to get to this, but when you said the growing point elongates and it's higher up and the cow grazes it, what happens then? What does the plant do physiologically? Does it stunt it back, or what happens to it? Are you going to cover that?
Yeah, we are going to cover it a little bit here, and if I don't answer your question by the end, you can ask it again.
Okay, thanks.
But I believe I will cover it.
Okay.
All right. So jumping back in here, we're going to shift gears just a little for a second and talk a little bit about legumes and some of their characteristics. So legumes are another plant common in pastures. They're a specific type of forb. They're, from a forage value standpoint, they're often very digestible and high in crude protein. The reason is because they are nitrogen-fixing plants, right, due to their symbiotic relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. That fixed nitrogen is generally used by the legume for its own growth or released in the soil as the roots die off, or if the leaves aren't getting consumed, then those leaves die off, then it gets into that nitrogen cycle that way. And legumes are established just like grasses, either by seed or sprigs. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Stupid animations. Okay, legumes. So forb anatomy kind of varies a little bit between species. This diagram of legumes helps identify some of the common forb plant parts. Like grasses and other plants, forbs have apical buds that also can develop into flowers, and axillary buds that produce stems, rhizomes, and stolons. The main point to understand the difference, or one thing to understand about clovers or legumes, is that oftentimes that apical meristem can be a little more elevated because they can occur at these junctions in the stems, and so they can be a little, they're generally higher up on legumes and grass plants, and so when they're higher up, they're more vulnerable to being grazed. So legume recovery time, or the amount of time that it takes for them to regrow leaves and put out more forage to eat and process their own meet their own physiological needs, can be a little longer because they've got to create these growing points again, or just regrow and rebuild that infrastructure. You can see on this bottom chart, it has from 15 days to 45 days to kind of rebuild that infrastructure. And anybody that's watched cattle go into a new pasture, or most livestock, they like the clovers, so they go for those first, and they will hit those generally pretty hard, at least on the first day. So here's some pictures of some of our legumes and a few more notes about them. Most of the nitrogen that's fixed remains in the leaves and stems and becomes available to livestock in the form of protein. Much of the nitrogen that is consumed by livestock and then recycled in the system through their urine and manure. And, you know, not all legumes are the same, so actual nitrogen fixation rates can vary a lot depending on the legume, depending on the degree of nodulation and whether or not the right soil bacteria are there on the site. It can depend on pasture composition, right, on a per acre basis. If we only have 5% legumes versus 30% legumes, there's going to be a real difference in the degree of nitrogen fixation happening out there. Soil conditions, water availability, all these other things can also affect the degree of nitrogen fixation happening in a legume. Some things to know about legumes is that, well, not all of them are good forage. Sometimes just by nature of how they are, if an animal eats too much of it, they can cause bloat. Several have secondary compounds that can make them toxic. Some examples here at the bottom, creeping indigo, which I'm gaining experience with right now. Crotalaria has alkaloids, and coffee senna has quite a few classes of secondary compounds that likely limit the intake that livestock will have of these plants. Often legumes have some level of condensed tannins, and those are another type of secondary compounds. In the right amount, they're totally fine. In fact, they can be beneficial. They can assist with this bypass protein effect, where they kind of bind with proteins in the rumen and release those proteins later in the digestive tract of the animal. And tannins have also been shown to sometimes have these antiparasitic effects, or this big word, anthelmintic, can't even say it right, anthelmintic effects, which can be beneficial. And I know of just a handful of producers that actually try to put their animals on heavier areas with either legumes or other plants known to have tannins for this benefit, and they seem to have some success with it. So another quick quiz. Is everybody still paying attention? All right. I know that was so close, but it was really the best place to break it. So, okay, what's a legume? Everyone should be able to have this discussion with their clients. And, you know, part of the whole goal of this webinar for me is just getting some of that terminology out there and some basic understanding to build on, so that we can have really intelligent and productive conversations. All right, everybody got this one easy, yeah? Nitrogen fixing forb. Good. Next question. Are legumes good forage? Yes, no, or sometimes? Generally they are, but sometimes they can be dangerous and harmful. And so the correct answer for that one is sometimes. Good job. Okay, next question. How does the location of a legume's growing point compare to that of a grass? They are cuter. Right, just about everybody got this. Yes, they are higher. They are higher. They tend to be up at the tips of the branches. Good job. How does the legume fix nitrogen? Read it carefully. Via a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen-fixing elves, via nitrofixylation, or yeah, via bacteria. All right, good job. They don't. Legumes themselves do not. It's the bacteria that move into them and create those nodules on their roots that do. Very good. Okay. Where is most of that fixed nitrogen found? All right. Most of you got it right. Yep, it's in the leaves and the stems of the legume. They do not quite leak out in the roots and go into the soil, but they do stay in the leaves and the stems. Now, if the plant has such a severe degree of defoliation and roots die off, some nitrogen could be released at that point, but generally it's in the leaves and the stems. Good job. Okay, I think we have one more question. What factors affect nitrogen fixation rates? You can select all that apply. Right, there was a long list of things that can affect nitrogen fixation rates. Among them are the species of legume, the degree of nodulation, so that's a reflection of the relationship between the legume and the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Not the degree of nitrofixylation, that's a totally fictitious word. Pasture composition does determine the rate of nitrogen fixation on an acre basis. Soil conditions, water availability, and other environmental conditions all would have been correct answers. Very good. Okay. Moving on. Any questions? Okay.
What other environmental factors?
You had to ask me that right now. Sorry, I was already going into forage quality. Other environmental factors that would probably affect, it would be any number of things that would affect the health of that legume and its physiology. So insect predation could be a factor. Temperature could be a factor. What else? Mineral composition in the soil, whether or not that legume is kind of at its full, functioning capacity. Those would all be things that I'm sure would affect the degree to which that plant is able to support those bacteria, which are then able to function and fix that nitrogen.
I was wondering about temperature, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, forage quality.
Hey, one more question.
Sure thing.
You guys do cocktails, yeah? When you guys do seed rates and stuff, you guys add in these nitrogen fixation species?
You talking about when we do like a forage and biomass prescription?
Yeah, not to jump in that, but when you guys add in?
Yeah, it generally depends on the client's objectives, but I surely recommend that a good, and we'll get into this here in this section on forage quality, but legumes can really add a lot to the forage quality of a pasture, and its production, its productive capability and the performance of the animals on the pasture. So I generally recommend it, but it depends on, again, the client's objectives and what might already occur out in the field, or the availability of seed oftentimes too is a big factor. So hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, so talking about forage quality, when we consider the quality of a plant as a forage, we need to recognize that, number one, there's differences in forage quality characteristics between plants, between different species of plants. And then there's differences in a plant, in a specific species of plant at different growth stages. A grass is not a grass is not a grass. Different species have different forage values, and then even within a species, a young leaf will have really different forage value than an older leaf, and it's going to be different than a flower, and it's going to be different than a stem if you were to analyze them all separately. Forage quality is a really complex trait that depends on a lot of different factors and is measured in a lot of different ways, such as protein, fibers, starches, sugars, these anti-nutritional compounds or secondary compounds, some of the physical and olfactory characteristics of the plant. And most importantly, we have to look at the forage quality from the perspective of the animal that's going to be eating it. A dairy cow has very different nutritional needs than a bull or a horse or a calf. And so what might be good forage quality for one type of animal, may or may not be quote-unquote good for another. It might be fair or poor or excellent or adequate. All right. So several factors can affect forage quality. Here in the tropics, a really important factor to consider is the percent moisture, or the also described as the dry matter content. How much of the forage is just water? Next important after that is digestibility. And digestibility has to do with how much of the forage is fiber or roughage. Both the water content and the digestibility of the forage affect how available the energy and protein contained in the forage is going to be. And secondary compounds are, really important to consider too, because they can affect intake and performance. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of these things when we start talking in the grazing animals webinar next week. Intake, of course, is how much of the forage the animal can take in or consume, and performance is the effect of that forage source on the livestock's health and condition. Okay, so we're going to talk in more detail on some of these different factors. All right, so forage quality, looking at dry matter, okay? Younger forages are typically higher in water content. Older forages tend to be more bulky and they have more stem to them, so as a percent weight, there's less water than younger material. Here in the tropics, these two pie charts help to illustrate kind of the range of dry matter content in a plant at different ages. So you can see at 4 weeks what it generally can look like, and then moving up to 12 weeks. This data came from some of the CTAR publications. This matters because water dilutes the concentration of nutrients and can affect intake, because if the rumen of an animal is filled with a high moisture feedstuff, okay, it has to process all of that out in order to eat more. Some of our forages, like California grass, which is commonly 85% or more water, they're so high in moisture content that an animal has to have a really large rumen to be able to eat enough in a day to meet its nutritional requirement. Okay, so that's dry matter. Okay, so we just established that the majority of grazed forages is water, all right? The portion that isn't water is comprised of the actual leaves and stems that get consumed, which in turn are made up of plant cells. Those plant cells then are comprised of the cell contents, which is where the protein, sugar, starches are found, and the structural components of the cells, the cell wall. This is what makes up the fiber, okay? And the fiber is a loose term that we use to describe all the cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin in the plant. Okay, this is my best attempt to try to help explain this. Here's an example of a plant cell here. And, forage analysis are going to report two values to measure fiber. This neutral detergent fiber, also called NDF, and acid detergent fiber, okay, ADF. NDF measures hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin all together. ADF is a subfraction of NDF and is mainly just measuring the lignin and the cellulose. So the higher the fiber content, And the less digestible a forage is, the more time it's got to spend in the rumen. And when the rumen is full, the animal can't keep grazing, it eats less. Yeah, its voluntary intake starts to decline because there's no room. And, you know, this is a reflection of a lower forage quality because the animals aren't going to do that well on it. So here, this graph is going to help us see the differences between forages and in a forage as it ages. You can see at the bottom, we're looking at NDF and ADF for 4 common forages here in Hawaii. I'm sorry, I couldn't find good data on guinea grass when I was preparing this, so I just went with what I could find quickly, just to illustrate the point. So in all of these plants, okay, as we go forward in time, right, from left to right, from 4 weeks to 8 weeks to 12 weeks, the amount of fiber is increasing, and so the digestibility of these grasses are decreasing. If digestibility decreases, the energy content also decreases because the cow can't digest the fiber, so the energy can't be attained. It's important to be able to look at data like this and kind of, you know, have a vague understanding of the ramifications it has to a producer who's considering a new forage type to plant under forage and biomass planting, or when you're developing a prescribed grazing plan. You know, you're not going to be an expert on animal nutrition or forage analysis, and you're not expected to be, but at least have a basic understanding of these values and why they matter, okay? So the higher the fiber, the less it's digestible, the lower the quality. So fiber is increasing as the plant ages, and high fiber equals lower digestibility is generally a lower forage quality. Okay? Crude protein. Crude protein is not actually a true measure of protein in a forage. Rather, it is calculated from the total nitrogen content of the forage. The crude protein value is important since protein contributes energy and it provides essential amino acids for the rumen microbes as well as the animal itself. Nowadays, a lot of forage analysis are actually reporting protein in new terms such as digestible intake protein. Then there's another fancy name for bypass protein. But basically, it's another quality of the plant. It's important to be aware of. Generally, more palatable forages are higher in protein because the animal gets a better post-ingestive feedback. Okay, they feel better after they eat it. But it's also important to recognize and understand that with ruminants, about 70% of the protein that they actually get actually comes from the activity and the fermentation and what's going on with the microbes in the rumen. So crude protein is another value we measure. When it's higher, it tends to be a better forage value, but it's not everything. Okay, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of how ruminant proteins, you know, all that stuff happens because it's really complicated, and I really couldn't explain it very well. But again, just kind of have a basic understanding, and that the protein declines as the plant ages. It's highest when the plant is younger, and it does contribute to palatability of the plant and animal performance. All right. Here's a good graphic that I found that really kind of helped to summarize these concepts of forage quality, particularly over time as the plant goes through its growth stages. So early on, when the plant is in its leafy vegetative stage, the protein levels tend to be high, the amount of leaves, the ratio of leaves to stems tend to be high. And as that plant ages, it gets stemmier, the fiber content increases, and the protein content starts to decrease. And so the forage quality, the relative forage quality, you know, starts to decline as the plant moves through the boot and the heading stage and into the full bloom stage, where it starts to really bottom out in this graph. Okay. So that's our little chat on forage quality. I'm going to go in and do another quick series of questions, which I hope are helping to aid you in catching the high points and the things that are really kind of the important points. All right, so some of the factors that affect forage quality are right. There are several. Dry matter content, fiber content, energy and protein. Alkaloids and terpenes are two classes of secondary compounds, so that can affect forage quality. Or you could have selected all of the above, and y'all would have been right. So good job. Nobody selected none of the above. That's great. Okay, next question. True or false? Younger forages are typically higher in percent water content. Younger forages are typically higher in percent water content. True would be correct. They have less stem, and so they're mostly leaf, and they typically have a higher percent water content. Very good. Okay, true or false again? The dry matter content represents all of the fiber in the plant. Okay, a few more votes still trickling in. Remember now, the dry matter content is just a portion of the plant that's not water. So it's the fiber plus the protein and the energy and everything else. So the correct answer to this one would be false. Okay. NDF, neutral detergent fiber, does not measure which of these things? Typical analysis will report on NDF and ADF. One of its NDF measures all of these things except one. Which one? Okay, so you remember NDF measures all three, hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin. ADF just measures cellulose and lignin. So NDF does not measure what's inside that cell wall, the cell solubles. So the correct answer for this would be cell solubles. NDF does measure hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin. Okay, those are the main things that make up fiber. Good job. All right, a couple more questions. The higher the fiber in the forage, the better it is for you. More regular you'll be. Lower the digestibility, or better the grass is for napping in.
Don't tempt me.
Stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. Okay, good. Everybody got this? The higher the fiber, the lower the digestibility. Good job. Okay, true or false? Crude protein is an accurate measure of protein in the plant. All right, good. Most of you got this right. It is false. Crude protein is an estimate of protein. Actually, they are measuring the total amount of nitrogen in the plant. And so crude protein is an approximate measurement of protein. It is not accurate. Good job. Okay. And that was the last question for this quiz. So, jumping back into our slides, here we are. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit about good old photosynthesis. Everybody remember this from college. I know it's been a while for me, but in summary, sugars produced during photosynthesis are used as an energy source immediately, or they can be stored. These stored carbohydrates are an energy source that the plant can draw on when photosynthesis is inadequate to meet the current plant energy needs. Dormancy is a great example of a period when photosynthesis is low or non-existent. So during those times, the plant has to draw on these reserved energy, the energy that gets stored, in order to grow, in order to start growth as dormancy ends. The plant uses its energy for stuff like root replacement, leaf and stem growth following dormancy, respiration during dormancy, bud formation, regrowth following top removal, aka grazing. So main take-home message is photosynthesis happens in the leaves. The leaves are really critically important for that plant to be able to produce the energy that it needs, both to put into storage or to support current growth. These stored energy levels, they vary throughout the day. I can't explain to you exactly why, but they do. And that stored energy is really important, especially for plants that are going to undergo regular defoliation events like forage plants. Okay. Factors that can affect plant vigor. Okay, so there's lots of different things that can affect plant vigor, and we're a little bit familiar with some of this because we use it in our tools on grazing land. But environmental factors, obviously the biggest one out here is rainfall. Too little, or even in some cases too much, can affect the vigor of a forage plant. Soil composition and fertility, especially on some of our old cane lands, can have a big impact on the vigor of forage plants. Air temperature. We're going into winter up here in Waimea, and some of the grasses are really slowing down, especially our more strongly tropical grasses. Other things that can affect plant vigor is insect pressure. We have outbreaks right now. I've been hearing of armyworm. If that grass plant's trying to grow and these worms are eating the leaves off just as quickly as they can emerge, that's going to have an impact on that plant's plant vigor. Grazing pressure, okay, especially on our islands that have crazy numbers of ruminant wildlife that are roaming and jumping fences and coming onto pastures. That is going to be a huge stressor that's going to have an impact on plant vigor. Plant disease, all of these different things, affect the physiological ability of that grass plant. So those factors get impacted, they affect plant vigor, whether or not that grass has a healthy root system, how much stored energy it's able to keep and maintain, its ability to photosynthesize, whether it can produce enough leaves to actually produce the energy that it needs to grow, whether it ever makes it to its reproductive stage, whether there's presence of these growing points, and the stage of the plant growth all come into play when we start talking about plant vigor. So, we start trying to evaluate the plant vigor in a pasture, we've got to be able to know that there's a lot of different things that can be affecting it, and be careful that we are identifying the right things that might be affecting plant vigor, especially if we're going to identify it as a resource concern. Okay. So forage plant reproduction, we talked generally already, but our tropical forages, they mostly behave as perennials. Some reproduce and spread via seed, and some spread vegetatively. Many in fact do both. And the main thing is that understanding how a forage plant reproduces is important because it is going to affect the plant density of that forage plant in a stand and whether or not it's going to persist. Having a basic understanding of the key forage species and what they need to reproduce will be useful in helping the client to develop a management strategy to ensure that he's going to keep those species in there and not start pushing his plant composition or his plant community in another direction. Okay. It's a quick little graphic kind of demonstrating some of how plant vigor and density can affect forage quantity. So obviously the more plants you have producing more leaves, it's going to yield more forage per unit area, okay, versus plants with, pastures with plants that have really low vigor, or, you know, like this one down here, this grass is just hurting, or pastures that have lots of plant gaps. Okay, they're going to yield less forage per unit area, and usually we also are going to see other problems like weeds or soil erosion, etc. And finally, forage quality and forage quantity are huge. Again, they're hugely affected by the plant's age. Like we learned earlier, several of the measurements of quality change as the plant ages. So you see this quality line kind of drops off the older the plant gets, but yield is really low at first, and it increases as the plant gets older. So we have more pounds per acre, it's just lower quality when we're way out here, and then here we have very low yield, but it's really high quality. Okay. Obviously, when it comes to quantity or the amount of forage that a plant can produce, yeah, there's just a really big difference. And so optimally, usually we're trying to get in and develop management systems whereby the system is optimized for a good, healthy yield as well as, you know, really still pretty decent quality, okay? I'm going to talk for a little bit here about a disturbance. Basically, you know, now that we have this understanding of plants, we need to understand that, you know, disturbances occur in the natural world. A disturbance is anything that affects a plant's physical condition. We can have disturbances that are fire, flooding. Some parts of our islands we can even experience frost. An herbicide application or overdrift, chemical drift can be a disturbance. A mowing or a bulldozing would be a big disturbance. Insect attack. Grazing. Grazing is a disturbance. The type of and the degree and frequency of the disturbance is what's important, because it has the ability to affect the plant community, you know, in a positive or negative direction. And so a plant's ability to respond to a disturbance is going to depend on a lot of things, okay? Again, to reiterate, it's going to depend on the type and the degree of that disturbance. What happened? How much of that plant was removed? What's been left over? Is it able to photosynthesize? Was that plant able to replenish its stored energy or not? Is there moisture in the environment that is conducive to growth? Does the plant even have, you know, growing points available for it to regrow immediately? And the biggest thing is time. Time is needed in order for a plant to recover after disturbance. And, you know, in grazing situations, sometimes time isn't allowed when we are in a set-stop grazing situation. And all of these things are being affected because of that one management decision or lack thereof. And so I found these great graphics to help illustrate this. You know, for example, if we consider a grazing disturbance, okay, the degree of the disturbance or how much of the plant has been removed or grazed off versus how much of the residual is left, okay? That's a term that we'll use sometimes to talk about what we leave behind is a residual. When there's adequate residual, then the photosynthesis in the remaining leaves can support the regrowth of new leaves, right? It's producing these carbohydrates. And you have less stored energy that has to be moved from the stems or the roots in order to produce those new leaves, because we have enough solar panels up here that we can produce that energy, and the growing point has not been removed, right? Versus a more extreme disturbance, okay? We take off a lot more. This can happen because of grazing or mowing, but this is going to have a really different effect. Now we have way less solar panels, okay, to produce energy. Now the plant has to move stored carbohydrates up from the roots and the stem in order to produce new leaves. And so its energy reserves are going to go down. In some cases, you know, this could have also removed the top node, which might have been where the apical meristem was, and that would also slow down growth, because now the plant has to form a new growing point down at the base in order to produce new leaves. So the degree of grazing utilization, this is why we make such a big deal about it in the 528 standard, because it has a big impact on the grass plants and their ability to recover after a grazing event. So this thing that we call stubble height or residual is something we're going to talk a lot more about, especially in the third session when we talk about grazing management. We're going to tie back into a lot of these concepts and a lot of these things. So this is just a teaser, just to kind of start getting you thinking about it. And like I said, for some of you, this is total refresher and, you know, just get the gears turning to start thinking about this stuff. All right, one more quick quiz. All right, easy one. Where does photosynthesis take place? Right, obvious. In the leaves, the solar panels.
No, in the solar panels.
Yes, in the solar panels, in the leaves. Thank you. Okay, next question. What happens to the energy that's created by photosynthesis? You can have more than one answer. Right. It gets used for growth or it gets stored as carbohydrates. Very good. It doesn't make most plants glow, but it could produce a melody, I suppose, to that plant. We may never know. All right. One more question. A couple more questions. What energy does the plant use to regrow when it lacks the ability to photosynthesize? All right, everybody has a good understanding of photosynthesis. Awesome. It's got to come from energy that's stored as carbohydrates, right? The only place that plants get their energy is from the products of photosynthesis. It cannot come from the soil. It can't get it from anything nearby unless it's a, well, yeah, well, let's not go there. And yeah, it doesn't come from the animal's saliva. Okay. What factors can affect plant vigor? Yeah, attitude, morale, and leadership certainly affect the employee's vigor. But when you're talking about plants, it's primarily environmental, physiological, and stress. Very good. What is a disturbance to a plant? You can have more than one answer. Awesome. Very good. Right. Grazing, flooding, frost, mowing, pruning, a landslide, insects, feral animals, or a bulldozer, these can all be classified as disturbances to a plant because it will affect that plant's physical state. Very good. All right. What factors affect a plant's ability to respond to a disturbance? I'm so glad for this polling test, little quiz question ability in Adobe Connect. This is awesome because I don't have to, try to get you guys to talk. Just click, and it seems to work pretty good. Thanks, you guys, for participating. I appreciate it. Right. So all of the above would have been correct. Type and degree of disturbance, the condition of the plant after the disturbance, the availability of stored resources if it needs it, the presence of growing points, and time all affect the plant's ability to respond to a disturbance. Very good. Okay. We are almost done. Hang in there. Okay, understanding how forages reproduce is important because yep, it does affect forage plant density. It does affect forage plant persistence. You definitely will need to talk about it with the rancher someday, and it does relate to pasture health. So all of the above is the perfect answer. Very good. Okay. Oh, wait, we just did this one. Sorry about that. Okay, last one for this section. True or false? Forage quality and forage quantity depend on the age of the plant. All right. This one was an easy one for most of you. True, very true. Remember that graphic? Just it all changes as that plant ages, so good to be aware of. Okay. So that concludes most of the training for today. Just in summary, just to kind of tie this all back, why this stuff is important to us. We, as conservationists, we have to understand forages. If we're going to talk to a grazer, it's what they're all about. We have to understand how they grow and their value characteristics. We have to understand how it's measured and be able to talk about it. We have to have a pretty good handle on the ecological dynamics at work in the grazing land setting. This is what we really stand to bring to the table. Some of our ranchers are outstanding and they can explain and talk about ecological dynamics, all day long. But for a lot of them, they see stuff and they kind of know certain things work a certain way, but when we can kind of explain it a little more, it might help to explain what's going on out on their landscape. And it's most especially, this concept of grazing really being a managed or unmanaged disturbance. Not a lot of ranchers really kind of think of it from that point. Say, at least half the time, if not more than that, ranchers are focusing on their animals' performance. As well they should be, because that's what's, paying the bills. But if you really boil it down, that animal performance is tied to the pasture's condition. And so that's where, we try to do all of our help is helping them to understand their plant aspects and elements of what's going on in that pasture so that they can ensure that they're, the backbone of their operation, really what it's all based on is healthy and strong and vigorous. The better we understand these concepts, the better we'll be able to properly identify resource concerns, the better we'll be able to assist the producer in identifying and evaluating alternatives, and the better we'll be able to help them manage their grazing system towards achieving their goals and objectives. So that's what we're trying to do here, trying to help lay the foundation for this. We covered all of that in about an hour and 15 minutes when, you could take numerous college courses and numerous workshops that are going to talk about this stuff in way more depth. Again, I'm just trying to hit the high points, make sure we get the vocabulary out there so that we can talk to each other and build on this stuff as we start talking about more in depth on grazing management and grazing issues and conservation planning on grazing lands. So with that, does anyone have any questions? Anything they'd like to go back to or talk about? Or did I do such a great job? You guys are all great. Now, a lot of you probably had some of this stuff in your education, at least a botany course, plant physiology course. Some of us had even, agronomy or animal science courses or range, I know at least one other person had other range courses to help, really talk about some of these dynamics. Has anyone been to pasture land ecology yet?
You mean the training, right?
The training, the NEDS course, pasture land ecology or plant herbivore interactions? Those are two really fantastic courses. Earlier this year, I submitted to the acting ADFO at the time a list of recommendations for some of you to apply to start sending some of you to it. And my decisions were mostly based on your grazing land workload, your expressed interest in understanding this stuff and stuff like that, or your level of understanding. But those would be great courses to add to your IDP if you haven't already. Anytime you can get to one of those courses, you're going to be, just growing tremendously. That's where I really got my first taste for all of the nuances of what's going on out there, and they helped me a ton as I was learning how to do this job. Okay. So if there's no questions.
Good job, Carolyn. Thanks.
I got a question.
Sure. Okay, go ahead, Wally.
You know the last slides you had, they're not in the original?
Yes, I know.
Can you send them out? That's
yes.
pretty cool, that's why I like them.
I would be happy to. I'll also, if you want the quiz questions and answers, I can include those in the slide handouts as well. That's no problem.
Only the ones I got right.
Okay. Okay, so if there's no more questions, I have a quick evaluation that I worked into this thing in order to help me make sure that this is useful and helpful to you. So if you would, please humor me for a couple more minutes as I bring up these poll questions. I really appreciate the feedback. And you can be honest as you need to. I can take it. It's just important to me that this is valuable to you. I know how valuable your time is, and you guys have a lot of things vying for your time, so it's important to me that this is helpful and that I structure it well. So thank you. Okay. All right, I'm going to pull up the next question. I'm going to see if I can keep these active while I bring up the additional questions so people can keep going. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I'll keep bringing up the other ones. I really appreciate all of you calling in today and getting on this webinar with me. I'm glad there's no questions. That means that, some of you guys are, this is definitely refresher stuff probably for most of you, so that's great. But yeah, if there is questions, just speak up or, call me after. Can't promise I can answer all of them, but I will do my best. Okay, great. Well, from here, next week, Tuesday, same time, looking like same place. A lot of people are saying this time works well, and Tuesdays looks like is a good day for most of you that are responding. I realize this isn't very scientific, but for those of you that made the time to call in, thank you. And so next week, we're going to talk about grazing animals. We're going to shift gears. We're going to talk about the nitty-gritty of ruminants and monogastrics. We're going to talk about why animals behave the way they do, why they kind of have some of the grazing behavior that we see, and take some of these concepts of forage value and stuff and talk about why they matter in the digestive tract of these animals. Because, again, it's important for us to have basic level of understanding so we can build from there and of course, so we can talk about it with our producers. We are, after that, the next week, we're going to get into talking about grazing management systems. And after we have that discussion, then I'm hoping to switch gears and start talking about the real nitty-gritty details about conservation planning on grazing lands. and how do we apply the planning process when we're working on grazing land operation. I'm hoping that right as we get into that part of these webinar sessions series, that I'll be able to get some FaceTime with all of you. I was hoping to get everyone together here in Waimea. I'm still unclear whether or not the budget's going to support that. If it's not going to support it, then I have a backup plan, and it's basically going to be, you know, going around and kind of doing it with each of you in your own offices. But ideally, I'd like to get you together here. I'm just most familiar with here. I've got a lot of connections with people to get access to pastures and stuff, and so it's pretty easy. I am also trying to work on revising the grazing land condition score sheet and the grazing land trend worksheet. And ideally, I'm going to have at least a draft of that revision to kind of test drive with you guys during the training, and we can start talking about some of the concepts in those. I'm more interested in getting the concepts across. I want to make sure that you guys feel confident in evaluating a grazing situation for resource concerns, you know, pertinent to our job out there, what we're out there to do. So, yeah, that's coming. And if it doesn't happen before Christmas, it'll happen very shortly after. I know there was a little bit of concern or heartburn, dare I say heartburn, with some of the grazing questions that I put in the screening worksheet that's in draft form right now. I hope that most of you would know me well enough to know I'm not a unrealistic person. I'm pretty practical, and my goal with that is to really try to help make sure that when an application is going to contract, that number one, the resource concerns have been properly identified and we're prescribing the right things. Not every office has this problem, and if you've been doing grazing work and you know you've really not even had a need for me, then you probably won't have a problem getting passed and getting made medium or high priority. But really encourage you, if you have stuff that are, you know, most of the way done, or kind of, you know, you want to even just call me up and we can talk story about a situation you're working on, even if you don't have stuff ready to send me. The earlier the better. We all know how the holidays goes. I'm not planning to take real long amounts of leave, but I am going to be out a little bit between Christmas and New Year. But yeah, I'm here to help you, and I'm very happy to help you in whatever way I can. I need to know from you, though, the kind of help you need. And so several offices have been very good about calling and saying, hey, I need you to get out here. I have this project or this situation, and I'm not sure how to handle it. I'm more than happy to get there. Or if you're not sure about the step that you're on and you want to make sure that, you know, you're getting whatever I'm going to be looking for, if you're not sure about how to do a forage animal balance or whatever, give me a call. We can do a lot of this stuff over Skype, and I'm more than happy to make myself available. So thank you.
Carolyn, can I make one quick question? So we're just about to send a draft or maybe a final version of the all the trainings we've done to date with the links to review them and view them again